Hi everyone, Nicholas Buffett is here from Cyprus, sunny Cyprus but chilly Cyprus today. Today's video is all about data validation. We're going to understand what data validation is and how we can implement this in Excel. So first of all, let's get an understanding of what it is. Well, essentially, it's all about us or humans applying a set of rules so that data being entered into a program like Excel or even Access or a database is validated to be true. This allows us to, or hopefully allows us to prevent errors from data input, especially human errors. Now, data validation essentially is a set of rules that we set up, and whenever we try to enter data in a cell or in a database which has data validation, that data is validated against these rules. If it returns true, that means the data is okay and it will be entered. If it returns a false, then essentially it comes up with an error message, or should come up with an error message, and will not allow us to enter the data. Now, in Excel, we can apply data validation to cells which already contain data. But what happens if that data or some of the data in those cells is already wrong? How does Excel deal with this? Well, we're going to see that in this video. Other things that we're going to learn about how data validation works in Excel so that we can get a good understanding when we want to implement data validation on a number of cells. And the other thing that we're going to have a look at is how we can identify cells which contain wrong data after we've added data validation to cells which already contain data. Now, the last thing we'll be looking at is using formulas. We can use formulas, so the set of rules that we're going to be used to validate the data will be based on a formula, but remember those formulas must be formulas that return a true, false value. Let's get started. Okay, we're going to start off with this spreadsheet which I've prepared here, and we're going to be first of all looking at data validation on cells that do not contain any data. So I'm going to select this range of cells here and I want to implement some data validation. I will find data validation by going to the ribbon at the top and choosing the data. That's the data ribbon. And here's my data validation button here. Now, your screen may look a little bit different because my screen is actually zoomed into 150% to make it actually easier for you to see and follow what I'm doing. Now, when I click on data validation, I get this dialog box here, a very simple dialog box with only 3 tabs. We're going to be looking at the input message and the error alert message in a short while, but the one that actually applies the rules for data validation is this one here, settings. So currently it's set to any value, and this basically means that these selected cells, these cells here, will actually allow any value to be entered. So we want to change that. Clicking on this drop-down list box, we see the different types of data validation we can implement. So the first one here is whole number, and that's the one we're going to be looking at. But we've also got things like decimal, list, date, time, so on and so forth. And the last one we'll be looking at is custom. So let's begin with the whole number one. Clicking on whole number, we see we get some more settings. We can choose whether it's going to be a number between two values, not between, equal to, not equal to. So here you're going to decide, depending on your needs or what kind of data is going to be entered, which one is more suitable for you. I'm going to leave between because I'm going to say it's something like a grade book. So I'm going to put it has to be between the values 0 and 100. Click OK. Now these cells here have got data validation. So if I was to choose any one of these, let's take the first one, put the value 0, press enter, that's allowed. If I put the number 100, press enter, that's allowed. Anything in between, let's say 55, that is also allowed. Anything outside of these extreme ranges, 0 and 100, will not be allowed. For example, 110. I get this stop message, and it basically says it's not allowed. So I'm just going to click on cancel, and if I then change that to something which is allowed, let's say 44, that's okay. Okay, now that error message that we get is not very helpful, so we can actually modify this error message here so that it makes a little bit more sense. So let's see how we can do that. I'm going to select my range of cells because I want to implement on all of these cells here. Click on data validation, and then I'm going to look at my input message. Now the input message essentially is a little bit of help for the user to understand what kind of data you would expect them to add. For example, I'm going to say this is grades. That's the title of the message. And it's going to say values I'm just going to put 0 to 100. Now you can add a little bit more detail to this. I'm just going to click on OK. Now whenever the user clicks on any one of these cells, you can see they get this little pop-up window, this little comment window says grades, values, 0 and 100. So that gives them some information about what kind of data you're expecting. That doesn't do anything about the error message, however. So if I now select these cells again, go back to data validation, I'm going to click on the error alert message. Now this basically allows me to modify the error message that pops up. And there are 3 types of error message. We're going to look at the stop first. So I'm going to put here title, wrong data range. I'm just going to put here values between 0 and 100 and click OK. So now if I was to put a value which is outside of that range, 110, and press enter, I get my custom message. Wrong data range, values between 0 and 100, and I've only got the option to either retry and try and put another value which is valid, let's say 99, that's okay, or the other option I've got is to simply cancel. And of course you've got help. Okay, so that basically blocks the user from entering an invalid value. So what happens if in some cases I want to check and make sure people don't enter values wrong, in other words out of the range of 0 and 100, but I want to give them the option to add a value outside of that range. I just want them to see that message to make sure what they're doing is correct. Well, I can do that from the error message. So if I click on data validation, go to my error message, and instead of saying this is a stop error message, I'm going to say it's a warning. Okay, and if I click on warning, and now on any one of these I add data which is outside of that range, 110, I get this pop-up window. So this basically says, do you want to continue? No or yes. Now if you click no, then it will allow you to change the value. So I'm going to put 120. But if you click yes, it does actually allow you to enter that value. So it's just a warning to get the user to double check and make sure what they're doing is correct. Now, the other one that we also have, so if I now change all of that, go to data validation and change that to information. Now, this is roughly the same thing. So I'm going to put another value, 110, but you get a different pop-up window and it only allows you OK or cancel. So if you click on OK, well, cancel will basically cancel it. There we go. If I add the value in again, OK will allow that data to be entered. So now I've got 2 values here which are not within the rules of that data validation. Okay, but they have been allowed to be added. So if you've got a lot of data validation in your spreadsheet and you obviously can't see where data validation has been applied on which cells, so it's going to be very hard, especially if you've got a lot of data, to identify which ones are outside of the range of the rules that you've set. So what you can do is simply go to your data validation tool here, click on the drop-down list box and say circle invalid data. And this will check your entire spreadsheet and essentially automatically circle all the data which is inside cells that have rules, data validation rules, and those rules are not being met. So the data in there is not following that set of rules. And you can now modify this. So if I was to change that to, let's say, 89 and press enter, you can now see this cell here, that ring has now been removed and it's valid data. This one here hasn't. So this is also true if you implement data or if you implement data validation rules on cells that already contain numbers. For example, if I was to select this one here that says weight, and I'm just going to change this a little bit. So I'm going to add data validation on these cells. I'm going to say this data validation is, let's say, a whole number. And again, I'm going to say it has to be greater than 50. Actually, greater than 100. Okay. And if I click OK, you can see automatically the ones which are not greater than 100 have been ringed. Now if I want to just remove these rings, I can go back to my data validation here and say clear validation circles. So there you go, it looks fine. Now If I then want to check it again, I simply go to circle invalid data and I get these rings. Okay, so let's get rid of all this data validation. How can we do that? Well, first you have to know where there are data validation rules. So that's one way. I know there's data validation in this one here. So if I now click on data validation on this range of cells, I can simply go clear all. Now, I've got more data validation rules here, and I know that. But if I didn't, and I want to erase some of that, well, let's say I'm going to erase the data validation from these 3 cells. I'm going to go to data validation and select clear all. So now these cells don't have validation. If I then select all of these, and that contains cells, these cells here, which do have validation, and the cells like this one here, which doesn't have validation, when I go to click on validation, because I've got a selection of cells that some already have some validation, I'm going to get an error message, or a warning message actually, or information, this one is, and it's just going to tell you that you've selected cells that have, some have got data validation, some don't. What do you want to do? Do you want to extend the data validation to these cells? Now, if you say yes, then the cells without the validation will have the validation, and I can click on yes. So now, there you go, there's the validation rule. I click OK, all of these have validation again. If I want to remove the data validation on all the cells in my spreadsheet, I'm going to click in this top left corner here to select my entire spreadsheet, click on data validation, and I say, do you want to extend the validation to all of the cells? I'm going to say no. And then from here, I'm going to say clear all. And that's going to remove all the validation rules on this spreadsheet. Okay, our next exercise is going to be to implement data validation using a drop-down list box. So let's just get rid of this here. Now, I'm going to demonstrate this using this column here, the display, the mono or color. And I'm also going to create a new one here so we can actually see the difference between cells with existing data and empty cells. So first of all, I'm going to demonstrate here. If I go to data validation, and this time I'm going to choose a list. Now, lists are really cool because especially when you've got fixed things that you're going to be adding all the time, let's say it's subjects, English, history, ICT, let's say it's states or countries, male, female. You don't want people to be typing these things out again and again and again. It's much easier if they have a drop-down list and they can simply use that. So there's 2 ways of doing this. I'm going to make a list here, and I can enter my list directly in the source by typing it. That's one way. So I'm going to put here, let's say male, and then comma, and then female. Okay, by clicking on OK, this thing here now, whenever I click on one of these cells, you can see this little drop down list box. If I click on that, I choose the item that I want. So yeah, practically impossible now to make a mistake. If you were to type the word male, for example, and you type it correctly, that will be allowed, but it is case sensitive. So if I was to use a small letter for the M, I'm going to get an error message. Okay, now again, these error messages, you can customize them, just like we did at the beginning of this video. So I'm going to click on cancel. So if you do want variations of something, then it's very important that you include those variations here. So if you wanted male with small m, you'd also have to type that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to clear all here, and let's just have a look. Clear all, okay, and let's just delete that data. So here where we've got mono or color, there's another way that we can do this. So we can use, you can see here, I've got a small list. So I can use a referenced list. Now, this is where we start talking about references again. Yes, Excel is all about references. Relative references, absolute references, and mixed references. Just like in the video with conditional formatting, which I will add as a link at the bottom in the description. So from here, if I was to go to data validation, I'm going to choose list. And for the source, I'm going to click on the source here, and I'm going to select my list simply by clicking and dragging. Now, here, right now, what it's going to do, this conditional formatting is with reference only to the first cell in the selection, J8. So it's going to check that the contents of J8 is the same as one of the contents of the items in this list, D1 and D2. if what's inside J8 is the same as one of those cells in the list, then it will be true and it will be allowed to be entered. If it's not, it will be false. It's not allowed to be entered. Now, then Excel is going to move down to the next one, J9. Now, because J9 is moving down, we don't want this selection of cells D1 to D2 to move down to D2 to D3. This is why in my formula you can see it's automatically applied absolute references for my list. Okay, so it has done that for me automatically, and because it does that automatically, we don't tend to pay attention to it, and we as users don't really understand how things like conditional formatting or data validation in this case really works. So the validation rule, you have to understand it from the point of the very first cell of your selection. Okay, so I'm going to click on OK here, and now I've got all of these here. We can see this one here is in small letters, mono. So that basically means if I was to click here and choose mono, it will change it. But if I was to type, let's say this one here in small letters, look at that, it allows it. So that's the difference if you're using a list from Excel, a range of cells as a list, or if you type the list manually. If you're typing the list manually like we did with the previous exercise where we typed here equals mono, comma, color, then it is case sensitive. Let me just cancel that. If you're using a list as a reference within Excel, it is not case sensitive. Okay, so let's have a look at another one of the data validation, the preset values that we've got. So I'm going to use this one here again. I'm going to go to data validation, and this time we're going to have a look at text length. Now this is a really good one, especially when you're entering things like serial numbers or ID numbers or anything which must have a fixed length or within a fixed length range. So text length. And you can say here the minimum. So if you're using between, you've got actually equal to, not equal to, greater than. I'm going to stick with between. So I'm going to say it has to be a text length which is minimum 3 characters long and a maximum of 7 characters long. So if I click on OK here, I can see that all of these here haven't been affected yet, but let's just check and see whether I've broken any validation rules. So let's just click here. Oops, sorry. Let's click on the arrow, circle invalid data. So I don't have any invalid data here. Everything is between 3 and 7 characters long. If I was to change one of these to even numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 numbers, I get an error. So the text length is actually based on numbers and text. It's alphanumeric. And this is really good, let's say, for telephone numbers, for ID numbers, and anything like that. Okay, so let's get rid of this data validation here. In fact, let me do it from here to remove all the data validation. Click on data validation, click no, clear all, and click OK. Okay, we're going to move on. We're doing some few more examples now, but now we're going to start creating our own formulas. Now remember, any formulas that you use, they must be formulas that return true or false values. Otherwise, they can't be used for data validation. Now, to do this and to understand a little bit more about how data validation works, especially when you're using references, so I'm going to do a data validation on the weight of phones, and the value which is entered in here must be a value which is greater than 25. It can't be less than 25 grams. Now, I'm going to do this first of all as a check to see whether my formula will work or not. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put here in this column here equals to, and I'm going to click on this first one. Remember, even with data validation, everything, the first formula that you enter for data validation is going to be related to the first one in the selection. So that will be this phone here. And I'm going to say this one has to be greater than or equal to the value 25. Now 25 here is a constant, so I'm just going to press enter and copy this down for the rest of the phones. We're going to see all of these return a true value. If I change one of these, let's say the second one here, from an 83 to say 20, I'm going to get a false value here. And that's normal because that rule is now false. It's not greater or equal to 25. So that formula seems to be working just fine for me. So I can now implement that. If I change that back, I can implement that as a data validation rule. I can actually use this formula. Before I do that, though, I also want to show you what happens if we're going to use a cell reference? So if I get rid of this formula here and I change it, instead of using the number 25, let's just do that from here, as it's actually going to be easier for you to see. So again, I'm going to do equals to this phone here, this weight here is greater or equal to this value here. So the cell reference B4. Now, if I do that and press enter, if I copy this down now, we're going to see all of these become false. And the reason why is because this formula is okay for this first one that we're looking up here, which is C8. That's absolutely fine because we're using C8 and comparing it to B4. As we copy this down, we then look up the value for C9, but B4 becomes B5 and so on and so forth. So this one here, for example, we can see it's using here C13, but instead of looking at B4, this red cell, it's gone all the way down to B9. Now that's because it's using references, it's using a relative reference. So to make this formula work, we would have to change this B4 here, select that and press the F4 key on our keyboard to make that an absolute reference. Now I'm not going to go over absolute and relative references again. There are videos and I can put a link down in the bottom where you can go see about conditional formatting where I explain all of this. But that there will now work. So if I copy that down now, that's all good. And if I change one of these, say from 85 to 20, that becomes a false here. And that's perfect. And I can check this by selecting this result, clicking in the formula bar, and I can see the B4 is not changing because it's absolute reference. But this one here from C8 has changed down to C14 as I copy down because it's relative referencing. So because I can see that this here formula, this first formula now actually works, this one here, then I can use that for my data validation. And I'm going to leave this column here so we can actually check and make sure that the results we get with data validation are the same as the results I get in this test column here. So I'm going to copy this formula over, Control C. In fact, no, I'm going to generate it from the beginning. So we're going to select our cells. Remember, select, then do. These are the cells I want to apply data validation. I'm going to click on validation. I'm now going to go here. I'm going to choose custom. And for my formula, I'm going to type. Now, what am I typing? I'm typing this one. I need to select this one here. So it's going to be equals to, because we're actually saying C8, which is our first cell in the selection. So we're going to say C8 equals to, C8 is greater or equal to, and I'm now going to put first of all 25 so we can see that. And that was the first formula we did. If we check for any invalid data, there we go, we've got one here and that's correct because that's 20. That says false, so that's good, that works. But that will only work for that constant value. So I'm going to now modify this and I'm going to use, instead of the value 25, I'm going to use my cell reference. Now notice here, Excel has not put absolute referencing for me. So it's going to be looking at this first cell, C8. It's going to be comparing to see if C8 is greater than equal to B4. Then it's going to move down to C9 to check this one to see if it's greater or equal to B5. Because it's relative, it's going to move down. Let's just see this problem appear before we fix it. Click OK. And now if we have a look, if I go to my columns, we can see here all of these are wrong when they shouldn't be. And the reason why is because my B4 here changes to B5, B6, B7, B8, B9, as we saw before. So to fix this, I'm simply going to go here, select my B4 and make this absolute referencing by using the F4 key on my keyboard. And click OK. And now you can see the only one which is outside the limit, and that's the correct one, is this. So you can see now that this cell range here is the same as the results I'm getting true, false here. There's only one false. And you can see that the formula which I used over here in L8 is exactly the same as the formula I used for my data validation. Okay, so you can always write your formula in another column, a check column, make sure your true false results are coming out correctly, and that way you know what you're doing is correct. Now, of course, using the cell reference like I did here, is always better than using a constant, because if you were to change the limit, or you want to change that value, you don't have to change the formula or the data validation. You simply change the value from that cell reference. So let's say I'm going to change this now to 100. So all mobile phones have to have at least a value for the weight, which is 100 and more. Then if I do that now, if I check now my columns, I can see I get a lot of these which are not valid data, but that's correct because these ones here are under 100 grams. Okay, so that's a good thing about using cell references rather than putting in the constant. So if I change that back to 25 and press enter, now you can see when you're using formulas like this, these rings, they don't update automatically. You need to click on it again. So I'm going to click on circle invalid data again, and then it will update. All right, so let's move on to the next exercise. Now, I want to show you how you can implement OR statements and statements in data validation. So I'm just going to get rid of all of this data validation. I'm going to select this top one here, data validation, no, and clear all, click OK. So there you go, everything's gone. So this first exercise I'm going to show you how we can use the AND statement. Now, I'm going to select on my weight column. So I'm going to select these numbers here, apply data validation, and I'm essentially going to do a between command. I'm not going to use the between command. I want to use the AND statement instead, so we can see how we can actually implement this AND statement. So I'm going to click on custom. I'm going to say, now again, this formula that I'm going to write here is going to be with reference to this very first cell only. And as I adjust this formula, I have to keep in mind that this formula is going to be copied down. So I'm going to think about relative and absolute references. So I'm going to start off with equals to AND statement, open brackets, and my first statement is going to be C8. So this one here, I'm going to be working on this one, is greater than or equal to 0, comma, and now I'm going to put my next condition, and I'm going to say C8 is less than or equal to, say, 200. I think that's a fair number. All of them have got it. And then I can close that. Now, this is going to return a true or false value based on this first cell here. And if I click on OK, that's been implemented. If I check for any errors, no invalid data. And if I was to change this 105 to, say, 201, I get that error message because it's not within that range. So I've basically done a between statement between this number and this number, but using the AND statement instead. Now, the next thing I want to show you is an OR statement. So I'm going to do this from here. So I'm going to select this here and just change all of this. I'm going to say, so this is going to be equals to OR. I'm going to open the brackets and I'm going to say, again, based on this very first cell, C8 is less than or equal to 200. Comma, then I'm going to put my next condition. I'm going to say it's equal to the actual, so C8 is actually equal to 5,000, equal to 5,000. Okay, or it's going to be, it has the word heavy inside. So I'm just using now a mixture of numeric data and text data. So C8 equals to, and I need to put this in speech marks because it is actually text, the word heavy. Okay, so what is this saying now? So this is basically saying these cells here, in this range of cells, can only accept values which are less than 200 or equal, the actual number 5,000, or the word heavy. So if I click on OK, there we go. Let me check for any invalid data. Nope, I don't have any there. So if I put any number, let's say in this one here, 105, I put any number under 200 or the number 200, that's fine. If I put the number 210, for example, that's an error. If I put the number 5,000, however, because we've got that rule in there, that's allowed. If I type any other text value, like say hello, that's not allowed. But if I type the value heavy, that is allowed. So that's an OR statement. So you can have a combination by making your own formulas. Okay, so let's do the same now. I'm just going to get rid of all of this data validation and get rid of all of that. Nope, clear. Okay, so we're going to do one more last exercise based on this column here, the mono and color. And we're going to be using, again, the or and statements. So I'm going to start off like this. I'm going to click on data validation, not that one. I'm going to click on data validation, and we're going to make our own custom one. And here what I'm going to do, I'm going to say equals to, or, and we're going to start off, let's just move this out the way there, J8, again, we're working on that very first one, equals to the word mono. Okay, or we're going to have the word color. So I'm going to put comma, J8 equals to the word color. Now notice I'm writing these in small letters. Close the speech marks. Click OK. Now if I check for validation errors, no validation errors here. Okay, so if I put this as mono, it actually allows the small and large letters because it's in a formula. Okay, now then, let's go and change that now to using cell references. So I'm going to select this and I'm going to get rid of that. I'm just going to leave the or part. So this time I'm going to, instead of using the actual text values, I'm going to say J8 equals to whatever's inside. Where are we? Here we go. D1, comma, J8, whatever equal to whatever's inside D2. Now, here we're going to see that we are going to have some errors because as this, it only applies to the very first cell. As Excel then goes down to check the next one and the next one, D1 is going to become D2, D2 is going to become D3, D3 is going to become D4. So we're going to start getting some errors because it's going to be looking at blank cells. But let's just have a look at this error pop up. So there we go. If I now go to circle invalid data, we can see this data now is coming out wrong. Okay, and that's because it's actually moving down here. So to fix that, I'm simply going to go back. I'm going to change the D1. So click on D1, press F4 on the keyboard. D2, press F4 on the keyboard, click OK, and now you can see these circles for invalid data have vanished. Okay, I think that's about everything I wanted to cover on data validation. Let's just have a quick look here. The only thing that's really left are things like decimal values, dates and times. Again, you know, you can choose a date between a date and an end date. You can change, you know, greater than, equal to. You can just mess around with these. The principle is exactly the same. So what you do need to remember when you're working with data validation is the fact that if you are going to use cell references, you need to keep in mind those references, absolute and relative references. You need to use the invalid data option so it can circle any data which is invalid, especially if you're applying data validation to cells which already contain data. That will really help you to identify if your validation rules are working properly or not, or if you have data in there which is invalid. A really good check is always to write the formula you're going to use. So if you're going to use your own custom formula, write the formula you want in another column, a separate column, just a check column, and just see the true false values as they're copied down. That way you know that you've actually made the formula, you put the formula correctly, and you've applied the correct absolute or relative referencing. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something. And if you have, make sure to like, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you again in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.